All right. Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in just about 5 minutes. We're glad to have you joining us today. If you want to share in the chat where you're joining us from, although Dawn, I already see you, you have it there, Wake County. So wonderful to have you and good to see you, Dawn. But if you all want to share where you're joining from and what your role is in the chat, that way you might recognize some others, and it'll be great for our panelists to kind of know their audience today. Welcome, everybody. We're glad that you're here today. If you want to share in the chat where you're joining us from and what your role is, it's always great to know who's in the room with us. Hi, Dawn. Great to see you. And yes, it's wonderful to have our COSIN team here. Christine and Jill, great to have you. Jim, welcome. Glad to have you here. And Greg. Glad to see you. All right, as others are joining us, it's great to have you go ahead and share where you're joining from and what your role is. And we'll get started in just a minute. All right, well, yes, we're going to get started. As Christine just mentioned in the chat, many districts are just getting started, and I know this is such a busy time of year, but this is always an important topic, especially now, and as we're kind of facing many difficult decisions again, once again this year. I know that this is will be a great learning opportunity for all of us. So welcome. So glad to have so many of you all here with us and with us this afternoon for this COSN webinar on solving broadband equity disparities. I'm Nancy Mangum, and I am the COSN subject matter expert for digital equity, and glad to be the host today. Our COSN Digital Equity Initiative is an important initiative, and we are so thankful to all of our initiative sponsors for their support in this work. On the next slide, you'll see, so we just want to welcome you all. You have shared in the chat, and it's so great to have many of you joining us. But just kind of out of curiosity, if you'll put a letter in the chat, how are you working with your state to improve access to learning for your students? So that access issue, that broadband issue, how are you feeling? Are you working closely with them? Are you talking about it from time to time, or are you kind of out there on an island? If you will put that letter in the chat, and that way our panelists can kind of begin to see where our audience is on this issue. Our session today, we are so excited to have our Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction panelists and presenters here with us today, and we are very glad to have them. We will have some time, you'll hear from them and hear about the things that they're working on and how it is making an impact for the districts in Wisconsin, but also we will have time for Q&A. So as we go through today's session, if you have questions or things that you're curious about, you want to hear more about, please put that in the chat, put those questions in the chat, and our panelists will see it, and we'll make sure that we can hopefully address your questions today. I want to introduce now our presenters and panelists today. We have a great team with us joining us today. We have Annette Smith, and Annette is the Director of Instructional Technology Services, the Division for Libraries and Technology at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and she will be our moderator. We also have Jen Lotz. Jen is the Instructional Technology Coordinator at Hudson School District. So we are glad to have Jen with us today. We also have Kurt Kiefer. Kurt is the Assistant State Superintendent for the Division of Library and Technologies. He is actually just newly retired, so we will give him that, but we are glad that he is joining us, as well as Alyssa Kenny, our Director of Digital Access and Public Service Commission in Wisconsin, and then Rachel Spellman, sorry, Rachel, the E-rate and broadband consultant and division in the Division for Libraries and Technology in Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. So we are glad to have Rachel, Alyssa, Jen, Kurt, and Annette joining us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Annette.
So thank you, Nancy, for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for attending this webinar today, where we are going to share our story. What did Wisconsin do to help with broadband equity throughout the pandemic, and how are we going to continue that work? And how did we get here? So we're going to start with the COSN survey and what we learned, talk you through how Wisconsin identified the problem, how we approached it, and then we're going to jump into the story of one of our school districts and how they worked with a number of different groups and organizations and agencies to address their students' needs. We'll talk about the data, how agencies across the state collaborated, and then what are we doing next? So how did we get here? With that COSN survey, the things that we learned, and that, you know, I've been in this field for 20 plus years, and these are things we had been talking about, but now we started to really be able to focus attention on this problem and prove that learning with video is essential for students to get a high quality education. They have to be able to interact with other adults and educators through video, through being able to see faces. We know that our students are mobile and that they really rely on that affordable high-speed internet. And some of our communities in remote and rural areas require more, as well as in some of our inner city areas where they live in neighborhoods that really struggled. And then that support and resources. The remote learning is significantly impacted by what device a student has and the quality of that device and that access. So these are things that we started to see hard data to prove. And so in Wisconsin, we had to define that problem so we were all working in the same direction, right? So that we get everybody on the same page and really pinpoint our resources and our work. And so we defined that problem as ensuring every K-12 student and library patron has access to affordable, quality broadband for learning wherever they live. And it was really important for us to focus in on that idea of where was that student at any given time. So this isn't an easy problem. If it was easy, as I said to so many people who would come to me and say, well, just do this. It's not easy. It's a significant problem. It is a complex problem. And if it was easy, it would already have been solved. So we had to look across all of our agencies, teams, public and private, because we knew that no one size would fit all solutions, right? Like we had to think, how do we address it, all these different use cases? And that a rapid response was required. Because I know in our state, we heard that we might close down on Wednesday. We heard that it was really bad on Thursday, and our governor closed the schools on Friday. Like it required a rapid, I mean, a really, really rapid response. So in Wisconsin, we listened to what our libraries, our districts, and our schools were telling us. We gathered data in collaboration with our internal stakeholders at DPI and with our external groups, so our schools, our libraries, other agencies. We partnered with the Public Service Commission and Workforce Development and so many other agencies across the state. And we are using that momentum to keep going. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Jen Lotze. She is the Instructional Technology Director for Hudson School District in Northern Wisconsin. And she's going to talk a little bit about what they did. So Jen?
Thanks, Annette, and thanks to Cozen for having me, and thanks to DPI for asking me to join today. Probably just like many of you who are on this call, we all had to shift really, really quickly. We in Hudson, just a little bit about us, we have about 6,000 students and right around 900 staff members, depending on the day. Technically, we are probably considered rural, but not really. We really function like a suburban school district. And our district covers 3 different cities: Hudson, North Hudson, and Holton. And each of those cities is really dynamic as far as what the terrain looks like, broadband access, etc. We recognized that we have areas within our district that are families within our district that don't have access to affordable broadband services. Prior to COVID, it was one of our long-term goals to, really try to bridge the gap as far as the digital divide for broadband access. So prior to COVID, we had 13 hotspots for families. Now, before we even did anything, when we started to see the COVID writing on the wall, about 2 weeks before Annette talked about the governor closing down schools, I kind of thought like, okay, well, maybe we should just get some hotspots just to be sure. And so thankfully I have a really, really great partner in our finance department that just said, whatever you think you're going to need, just go for it. So we were able to, about 2 weeks before, place an order for some hotspots. So to talk a little bit about what we did, like I said, we knew that we needed hotspots. We had no idea what to do. Just like many of you were like, oh, we definitely need Chromebooks. We need hotspots. We need all these things. And so I had remembered 2 years prior that T-Mobile had reached out and said, hey, Jen, this is something you might need. Think about Wi-Fi for buses or whatever. And being a new leader in the position, I was like, sure, I'll put it in a file somewhere and hold on to it for when we get to that place. And we got to that place in February of 2020. So thankfully there was Project 10 Million, and DPI was really great about sharing with us all these different projects and grants and things that we could apply for as districts, specific to what coverage was in our area. Oh my gosh, sorry. Specific to what coverage was in our area. So T-Mobile had some pretty great coverage in our region, so we applied for that. But to apply for that, you have to have data that says that this is a need. So thankfully, prior to COVID and all of this stuff really going down, DPI had reached out to us as district leaders and said, hey, we'd really like to start collecting this data. I'd like to know what families in your districts, or like, is this a need? Is there a broadband need? Is there a digital equity gap? Which we all know there is, but the data is really what needs to sing through all of this. And so I was on the committee, and we developed these questions that we could all put in our Skyward or Infinite Campus or Power School or whatever system we used that would also ultimately allow us to collect that data. What we didn't really think about at the time was how powerful that data was going to be. Because when we collect that data and we share it, of course, we sign a data sharing agreement because student privacy is of utmost importance. It gave us access to these beautiful maps that would allow us to see where all of our, essentially like our dark spots are, where there's not great coverage, or it's not affordable, or students can't stream, or all of those things. And that was actually in partnership with the Education Superhighway as well. So we got so much data. And on the next slide, I'll show you a little bit what those questions really are. Thankfully, we were able to push this survey out really quickly in Skyward and spin it out to our families. So then on the day when our students left, when the governor did shut down schools, we were stuffing hotspots and Chromebooks in their backpacks, probably just like all of you. Like, thankfully, just whatever they had, we're like, okay, you. Now, after we started to get into things, we're like, oh gosh, one family has 3 children and we gave them 3 hotspots. Okay, so we'll fix that up, but just so something to keep in mind. So on that next slide, you'll see that those questions are there. So you'll have access to that, but that's how the maps are really built for us. So we learned through that survey is that over 100 households could not afford internet or had inadequate access. So like I said, just like many of you, we provided 150 families with hotspot access in the spring of 2020. But in addition to that partnership and collaboration, it wasn't just about a hotspot, because that's something that we can do, but that isn't going to meet the needs of all of our families. A hotspot isn't going to work everywhere, especially in Wisconsin. There are valleys and peaks and valleys and low spots and prairie and everything. And so it wasn't just about a hotspot. It was about really finding connections and support for families beyond just a hotspot connection, whether it's a wired connection or connecting them with the right people for the rental assistance, all of that stuff. So things that we learned, we didn't know the extent of that digital equity gap. We just didn't know. And our definition of equity really changed during this time, because we think of, we've done so much work around equity in our district, and we continue to. It's not something that you're ever done with, but we really redefined that definition of equity. It's now so much bigger. Students don't have access to internet, and even our families that could afford a really strong connection still couldn't even access it. So redefined equity. We also learned that we have a lot of work to do moving forward as a community to increase high-speed broadband. So our county is actually doing a full-scale broadband survey, or completed that, to make plans moving forward. And then we also learned that, privacy and safety considerations are of utmost importance. So we made sure that all of our hotspots and any connections that we established for students were SIPA compliant and just safe for them, but also that data was safe within our district hands, that, you know, if a family indicated they couldn't afford something, that was really private and safe for us to hold on to as well. So without our partnership, we certainly would not have gotten through. So like I said, what's next? We're going to partner with our county for a large scale broadband survey. We work to support our broadband providers regionally to submit PSC grants, which actually you're going to hear about probably in a little bit. And then every single year when parents register for school, they complete this survey. So we always have real-time data about where students are at as far as devices, broadband access, how strong that signal is, et cetera. So we're really excited that that's in there. Students have to complete that form when they're registering for school. So that's Hudson.
That's great, Jen. And in case some of the folks on here are interested, is that are you willing to share that survey, or have any links that you could share?
Absolutely.
It's nice to have that. So
absolutely, I'll put the link to the DPI website that has all of it on there in the chat.
Wonderful, thank you.
And we've got that link later on in the slide deck for you to post also, Nancy, that takes them to the questions and all of the work that we've done.
Perfect, thank you. I'll share
that. Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you for being such a great partner and working to solve this problem. So next we're going to go to Kurt. And Kurt, what role did DPI play in gathering and providing data to demonstrate the hard facts about broadband and device inequity across the state? And how did we do it so quickly?
We didn't do anything. No, I'm kidding. We did a lot, but mainly we did it because of folks like Jen. Let me just say this too, Annette, right off top, you know, thanks to the whole COSN crew, Keith and Nancy and Jill and Christine, I know you're there. I mean, this is an organization that really helps sponsor some of the things that we're trying to do at scale as well. I think that was the key to all of this, was this notion of partnership and working together. And you heard a lot of that from Jen, and I know you're going to hear a lot of that from Melissa and Rachel as well. But the key around the data was certainly because of that. We've been working for the last 5 or 6 years on data interoperability for part of our state and federal reporting. We went down the EdFi path. There are different ways to do that. We had chosen the EdFi path to do it. And all of that work that we had done with the SIS vendors all along the way for that, that purpose really served us well with the need to scramble. One of the things Jen mentioned was the size of her district. It's really important to understand that in Wisconsin, like some states, probably many states, we've got 425 school districts, and the median size district is 900 kids. That means, if you remember your stats classes, that means that over 200 districts have fewer than 900 kids, or a graduating class of 65. So we're talking about little districts that can't necessarily pull a whole bunch of stuff off. They can, many of them can, but not all of them can. And so that's always been our motivating factor with a lot of this is, let's get in there and solve problems once on behalf of 425 school districts, and then they can reap from the benefits of what we sowed in terms of that kind of effort. So we've done that on the data side, and really to answer your question, we were able to partner with those SIS vendors, EdFi, Education Superhighway was mentioned by Jen, and we work very closely with other organizations like COSN and CETA and what have you, but then also in the case of, for us, it's the Council of Chief State School Officers, CCSSO. That was another huge partner for us. So on all of it. And what we did in terms of standing up different things was a variety of these different, and I'll just share some of that in a second. But as Jen mentioned, there were some common questions. People like Jen were the folks who drove what those questions should be, along with others across the country. So the digital equity data, and Jen has alluded to some of these already, but one of the things you're trying to do when you're, this is a data problem. It was a data problem. Anybody who knows the issue about connectivity knows that it's really a data problem. The FCC maps are in terrible shape, and they're going to get better. there's no question, but at the time of the pandemic, they weren't. And we had done annual tech surveys of school districts and folks like Jen just to say, hey, can you give us an estimate of how many kids, what percentage of your kids don't have access? Well, come the pandemic, that wasn't good enough. And so that's when we really needed to kick this into gear. But to get people motivated to gather data, short of a pandemic, you also have to help them understand why you would want to gather the data through the tools that we're providing to them. And this list that you can see on the screen now was that partial list, and there's a whole bunch of this. I think it's kind of interesting. I said early on, you know, and I know Annette and Rachel, you heard me say this too, is that, you know, so many people are not paying attention to, you know, just do it. You don't have to collect the data. You know, it's like, it'll be okay. Just get things going. And that was the spirit that needed to prevail. There's no question. But sure enough, you know, there's also this thing about accountability, and pandemic or not, you're going to have to show some data that says, here's how we were able to impact things. And in the long run, that's what we've been able to do is with some of this stuff. The dashboards were something that we developed uniformly. We leveraged the statewide data dashboard tool set that we had in place for years and years and just added some dashboards to it. That's the example that you see here. This is the district secure side of things. They can drill down, they can see kids' names and what have you. Again, it augments their student information system data, but it's there for everyone. The next slide is the slide, of course, what we did for the public side of things so that the public could see what kind of progress we were making on some of these key questions and whatnot. And again, as Jen mentioned, the data is real time as they gather it. So if they're gathering it through Skyward Infinite Campus, Power School, and in Wisconsin, there's 20 other student information systems that are used. It can be moved through that interoperable system in real time and find its way onto these dashboards. Next slide. Thanks. Yeah, and so the other the other way of presenting the data that was really important was geospatial. And this is where we partnered a great deal with our friends at the Public Service Commission because they have some great GIS skill sets. And so our folks got together with theirs and really pulled together some different ways to display the data. This was an example of that by district. You can kind of see the questions geospatially. This is a public site as well. Next slide. And then we did partner with the PSC because we took the boundaries for the ISP service territories and overlaid them with the school districts so that you can, a person like Jen could click in here and say, oh, well, if the kid lives here, then here's the providers that are available. Next slide. And then this was the partnership with Education Superhighway where they actually built out this interface where you're able to literally put in addresses of students and addresses of service of where service is provided by ISP, and an IT director in a school district can very, very crisply and clearly identify the players that are available. Now it's all contingent on people submitting data. The other key part of this that folks like Rachel played a key role in was the data governance on the data privacy and security side. So we, again, operationalize that at scale statewide and in partnership with folks like Education Superhighway. So next slide. And then, of course, here's the data itself. We have about 2/3 of the district's reporting data. Again, this is a voluntary thing. They don't have to do it. But it does represent, and I think the numbers are a little bit larger than this now, but better than 40% of the kids. So we're having a lot of the smaller districts report. And that makes a ton of sense because they're the ones that have had the hardest time in terms of just, geographically being able to identify ISPs that can serve kids. But then the data is really helpful in terms of some of not only the operational things that I was just describing in some of those tools, but also from a policy kind of perspective. And I know that Alyssa will mention a little bit about this too, in what she's talking about. These data are really important from a policy perspective. So right now, our estimate is that about 24,000 kids just simply don't have access, either because they don't have a provider, or they can't afford it. They still can't afford it. And that's an issue that's hopefully getting assuaged a little bit by things like the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program and the programs that are the subscriptions that school districts are purchasing for their kids using their relief money and things like that. And of that, there's a specified 14,000 right now that are indeed identifying as being connected through that temporary access that they're getting through their school district. But the other important thing that we asked in addition to access was the question about performance. And this is something that I think is, sometimes lost, is it's not just a matter of who's connected. It's really what kind of a connection do you have, and are you able to support the use case that you're looking for, which is learning. And that's a video-driven thing. And right now, flat out, there's, in the questions when we ask parents of those that are reporting, we extrapolate it statewide, it's better than, 27,000 that are saying, no, they can't. They just flat out can't. So if you add those numbers together, you get about 65,000 kids that either lack access or they just can't use it. And that number gets bigger if you look at the proportion of respondents saying that it works, but not well. And that number is very large. That's about 165,000 more kids. And then here's kind of a money slide, I guess, in a way, and that is that it's really important to understand, and policymakers need to understand this, is that this equal thing is not, this access thing isn't equal in any way, shape, or form. And so we've been able to, through the data that's coming through, it's all in the statewide data longitudinal, the data system, so that we're able to mash things like demographics together with it and other program characteristics. And that's what you see here. When you look at the question about do you have access in your residence, you can see if it's broken down by any of these different either race, ethnicity, or SPED or EL kind of categories. You can see the huge disparity that we've got, 2 to 1 in terms of white kids compared to black kids, for example. So, but without this data collection, without being able to marry it in with some of the other stuff that we've got on a real-time basis, you're not able to do these kinds of analyses. And so we feel good about that. The other real key piece of data that we've got is the speed test information. This kind of goes hand in hand with the self-reported, how good is your internet connection kind of question. So we did an outreach campaign. Rachel did the lion's share of all that work, working with MLabs. I point out another partner. So Measurement Labs is another partnership that was really important in this, and they helped us with modifying some existing dashboards and made it specific to school districts. So we've got a dashboard out there that school districts can use. All of that, and this was really important because, again, the data, the FCC data is pretty lousy. And so what this is doing is feeding that kind of stuff Jen has talked about in her area, her region now, with these folks putting together their applications for different grants. And with money flowing finally to do that, you got to demonstrate need. And here's the data that you can use to roll into those need statements. So, so anyway, that's kind of a quick overview of all the things that we've been up to in that.
Thank you so much, Kurt. And we'll talk about how we're keeping this moving in just a little bit. So, but before we do that, we're going to go to Alyssa Kenny from the Public Service Commission in Wisconsin. And Alyssa, what is the role of the PSC in broadband equity? And can you talk a little bit to those cross-agency collaborations?
Sure. Thanks so much everyone for having me. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Alyssa and I work at the Public Service Commission, and I supervise the Wisconsin Broadband Office, and we do a number of things that people are probably familiar with, but one is we offer a grant program for infrastructure deployment. We host the Wisconsin Broadband Map. We do some support and technical assistance for communities. And then we try to serve as the sort of coordinator and leader of information and partnerships around the state for broadband deployment and digital equity. And so partnerships are really important to us. We're a very small office at the Service Commission, and we have focused a lot of our energy on grants in the past, but this certainly the pandemic and certainly our partnership with the Department of Public Instruction has really helped provide us new important data so we can make some better policy decisions and grant decisions, and then also helped us direct sort of our own energy and outreach. And we've just been great partners together. And so I thought I would spend a little time talking about that. I also was going to go back to kind of the beginning of the pandemic. It's when I think a partnership that we had initially became, joint, kind of got on steroids, and we developed basically a rapid response team where we focused on sort of emergency internets, inventory and supply of hotspots, drive up Wi-Fi for people who didn't have access at home, just those real Sorry, there I am. Just those sort of basic needs. And then a group of a cross-agency, private and public group actually made a set of recommendations to the governor and the superintendent on some rapid solutions. And a number of those got implemented. The borrowing of a state-owned tower, some use of CARES dollars for some shovel-ready projects, and then some deployment of dollars for hotspots. And so that was kind of our entry into it. And then if you could go to the next slide. Thanks. And so I think people have talked about this, but one of the first things we did was establishing a data sharing agreement between the Public Service Commission and the Department of Public Instruction. And there are certainly all sorts of limits and privacy concerns, but it was important for us to be able to share the most granular data we had available about provider services, both where they are and where they might be coming. And then for that digital equity dashboard that Kurt was just sharing, for us to get that information by school district. We signed the agreement, we basically are using a secure ArcGIS portal that's updated monthly. And right now I would say we're really in that meaning making and learning phase. And I wanted to share a few of the things we've learned, and Kurt mentioned some of these, but one was, I think we had been always considering the issue of affordability, but the data from the Department of Public Instruction really brought that to the commission and the broadband office's eyes, that there is affordability issues that are really so significant that they're a barrier to access, and that there are thousands and thousands of households and kids in the state without access due to affordability. It was something that we always knew, but having a number was really important. And the other really significant piece was this adequacy of the internet or of the broadband. And so previously there had been a pretty strong focus of broadband dollars and grant dollars really targeted at what we would call unserved. So families with service below 5 megabits down and 1 up. And what we were seeing was this really clear need throughout the state for adequate good service that kids could stream videos on, and that we needed to think about our grant program in ways to not just focus on the 1 or 2 or 3% of people who had no access, but to everybody who had these adequacy issues and couldn't make full use of the internet. And so we used that data to do some of that learning. And then we also did some data stacking. And so we have some access to some data from the federal government, but we were able to stack that with some of DPI's data and learn a little more. And I think if you'll move to the next slide, I can show a quick example of that. And so this is just kind of a snapshot. We talked about how bad the FCC data is. So we can see sort of an FCC data with some state data from a county here in the state. And this one's actually pretty interesting. The FCC is reporting much worse service than we're seeing from the speed tests. And this might tell us a whole bunch of different things, and it might tell us some important stories, but then we can go pull the DPI data. It might mean that there's, some really dense areas in the center there that have great service. And then when you get to that outside of the donut, there's incredibly high need. And so the average is there. But so some of the things we're able to do with data are getting much more targeted and helping us really see more about the experiences of the people who live in the state. And the other thing I just wanted to add was just how incredibly important for the Public Service Commission, knowing where K-12 students are that don't have access is a really key data point for us, because where K-12 students are, that's a household that we're more interested in, right? It's very, it's not a second home. It's not probably a manufacturing area. So knowing those sort of geolocations and the density of where single families are is really an area that the commission was interested in targeting their grants in. So this data sharing has been important. And then just some pieces about our collaboration and action here. Kurt has been served on our governor's task force for broadband access, and really brought some of that data and that energy and that knowledge about what was happening for K-12 students and libraries into the task force in those discussions and recommendations. Rachel will be talking soon about the digital bridge, but we added a question on our grant application about if providers that were applying for grants are participating in that, as a way to both drive awareness, but also drive participation in that program, because the commission sees it as really important. We did some joint information about the emergency broadband benefit, and I'd like to say the state of Wisconsin just crossed 100,000 households enrolled, and as it remains in sort of the top 10 in state for eligible households enrolling in that. And then we're partnering together on a digital equity and inclusion stakeholder group, again, really working on those affordability, digital skills, devices. And what I think is the interesting pivot, or the thing that's really exciting about this partnership is previously we sort of had ideas and we were using data to support those ideas, or to provide accountability for our ideas and projects. And we're beginning to move into that direction where some of the data, along with the experiences of the people, really is going to drive the dollars and drive the decision-making in a kind of some new and exciting ways. And so I think with that, I pass
Thank
it.
you, Alyssa.
Thank you.
Rachel, we're going to jump to you next. How is DPI working to keep the momentum going and to be part of a long-term solution?
Thank you, Annette. We heard from Jen, Kurt, and Alyssa about the statewide data collection, analysis, and value of that information in solving the digital equity gap. And we're continuing to learn from this data as we support districts with their local data collection, analysis, and expanded use of the data. DPI is providing reporting tools, those secure dashboards and maps that Jen and Kurt mentioned, to assist schools with analyzing their data and tailoring the local solutions to meet student needs. One of our next steps will be to go more in depth with districts on how to analyze that data and look for their next steps. We provide sample communications for schools to share with their families about direct-to-consumer benefits, like the EBB program that Alyssa just mentioned. We also help schools take advantage of statewide discounted contracts for bulk purchasing of internet service through the Digital Learning Bridge. And we're continuing to share funding opportunities with districts and are engaging with private philanthropy to support this work. Last spring, we hosted a webinar about public-private partnerships to expand broadband, in which several school districts and other partners shared replicable models for fiber expansion. So I'd like to go a little further in depth on some of these topics, if we could go to the next slide. In terms of the digital equity data, collecting this data and reporting it to DPI was new last school year. So although we had high participation in the first year of the optional data collection, we're working closely with districts to expand the data collection for 21-22. And we're supporting the districts that have now built these questions into their annual registration materials, like you heard Jen talk about in Hudson, and they're collecting the data for the first time. And we're also working with districts who are reporting their data for a second year and refining their process and using the data, the secure dashboards and the maps. So DPI customer services team, one of our group of our colleagues hosts weekly WISE user group webinars, at which the digital equity reporting is a weekly topic, a standing topic. And districts are finding that their secure dashboards, as you've heard from my colleagues, those secure dashboards and maps are invaluable when it comes to having a needs assessment and applying for things like the Emergency Connectivity Fund. Wisconsin schools and libraries submitted 355 applications, or 66.6 million in funding requests during the initial application window. And a big piece of that was their ability to use their needs assessment and complete that part of the application with their digital equity data. In addition to the needs assessment for relief funding, DPI also provides the maps and the dashboards to help schools ensure that they're tracking and supporting the needs of each student. So they can drill down to the individual student and find a provider or find a way to meet that student's access needs. So if we could go on to the next slide, Kurt mentioned this a little bit earlier, but specifically One way that districts can support the needs of each student is to use our DPI secure data exchange. So we provide a secure data exchange service for school districts with the local providers in their area who have a data sharing agreement with DPI. And this secure data exchange allows districts to see which providers can reach a specific student address. Once a district has this information, they can compare provider options and choose to purchase a statewide discounted service on behalf of an eligible family through our digital learning bridge, or with other relief funding or emergency connectivity fund funding. As the next step, we're continuing to engage with our partners at Education Superhighway to automate this data exchange through Bridge to Broadband. And we're hoping to pilot this automated process this fall with a few of our districts. If we could go on. You heard from Jennifer at Hudson School District. You heard her mention the digital learning bridge. CISA Purchasing and the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction are working together to bridge the digital gap with statewide discounted contracts for hardware, software, and internet service. At this site, schools can go to one place to find discounts and do bulk purchasing of internet services. New this year, and I'm really excited to share that we're working with 2 private philanthropic organizations to create a pathway for private donors to support connecting eligible students. And we're using the data exchange and digital learning bridge processes that we have been successfully using for the last year. We're hoping to show success with connecting over 150 students through private philanthropy, and to be able to establish a clear pathway for donors that want to support connecting children in Wisconsin. We could go on. In addition, we've created a funding quick reference guide to help schools know which funding sources are available to support broadband and the eligibility criteria for each funding source. Our chart on the website is divided into 3 categories: direct-to-consumer programs, school district purchasing, and other funding opportunities to expand broadband. The emergency broadband benefit is listed under the direct-to-consumer programs. And I'd like to take a moment to thank Alyssa from the Public Service Commission, who you heard from earlier. She invited DPI to present at a webinar and share ideas about how libraries and schools could promote EBB. And that webinar actually springboarded into a library and school specific webinar that DPI hosted, in which we had an adult services librarian from a public library and the local school district technology coordinator share their experience with hosting an EBB registration event. That was another successful collaboration. If you could go on. The other thing is that the Department of Public Instruction is encouraging local governments, school districts, and healthcare to pool their funds to invest in infrastructure. The local government uses of pandemic funding, as you know, are limited, and broadband is one of the options that qualifies and is easier to obtain approval for. In spring, we hosted a webinar about expanding broadband. Districts and other partners shared replicable models for fiber expansion projects in their communities in around the state of Wisconsin. And guest speakers highlighted partnerships with other public entities, including private partnerships in using any funds available to expand broadband. If you could go to the next one. The guests also on this webinar also provided example materials for communications, bids, and contracts for their successful projects. And these collaborations in this webinar are a great example of how we work together on a long-term solution to expand robust and affordable broadband service in Wisconsin. This webinar was very popular, and many districts are now engaging with their local broadband task force and other community groups to address the needs in their local communities. I've actually heard when schools start to engage in this work that they're finding sometimes that their digital equity data and speed test data is the best data they have in their community. It's a great place to start the conversation, and the information is valuable for those local groups working to expand service and find long-term solutions. So with that, Annette, I think that concludes my section, and I could turn things back over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So before I go to the next slide, which is going to be a question for all of you, I am not monitoring the chat. So Nancy, are there questions for our panelists? I can ask them to turn on their cameras and we could, I think, take a few minutes to answer questions.
Great. Yes, I don't think that there are any questions currently, but any of our participants, if you have questions, now is the time. Go ahead and put those in the chat.
And while they're doing that, we as panelists had a question for people attending or people who might even be watching this later. After listening to our stories and the way we were able to bring together so many groups that maybe in the past had not collaborated, who is the person that you will connect with to help you in bridging the digital divide in your areas? So maybe getting you to think differently about solving this problem. And maybe, can they put that in the chat also, Nancy?
Yes, and we have a great question from Jim in the chat. So I'm gonna, oh, great, Kurt. Maybe Kurt, you want to jump in? The question from Jim is wondering about partnerships with the statewide higher ed network. And Kurt, do you want to jump on and respond?
Yeah, sure. Happy to, Nancy. So, Jim, we are very tight with WISNET. There's no question about that. I served on the board for my entire decade plus tenure at the agency. So, and I know that Annette and Rachel and their team meet on a regular basis with them to coordinate stuff. WISNET strategically didn't step into this one as aggressively. Which is perfectly fine. There are other things that they're trying to figure out. We also, early on, I had a lot of conversations not only with the state CIO, but also with the UW-Madison CIO. There was a role change there. So the new person, we got together and we chatted about what they could do. They were looking at different options too. So we didn't exclude that, but at this point, from our perspective, what they really are good at is helping us figure out more long-term what some of the solutions might be from a middle mile backbone. How do you get things connected perspective? And so I know that a lot of locals have been relying on them to kind of help them problem solve. Well, what kind of options do they have? So, yeah, we early on we were talking a lot with Dave Loyce and his team over at WISNET.
Thank you so much, Kurt, for helping. And it sounds like maybe Jim, Kurt is somebody to follow up with if you have additional questions about that. So another question coming in from Tom, wondering about, they have been asked with the city and county for broadband services, but the specifics around E-rate and their E-rate being very specific as to not sharing outside of the school districts. So what kinds of partnerships have others established with public entities and private service? And I know,
I think
so
Rachel,
anyone
can
want
you
to
take that
jump
one?
in and help with that question?
Sure,
Yeah.
I'd be happy to jump in. So Tom, you're right. E-rate is very specific about not sharing your school's E-rateable internet service outside of the district to student homes. And so in Wisconsin, we had this webinar where districts talked about how they pooled other types of funding and worked with their local task force to expand broadband where it was needed outside of E-rate funding. And I'd be happy to share a link for you to that webinar in the chat. Like I said, it was interesting to hear. So another example, it's not part of that webinar, but another example I've heard about is districts, when they go into these agreements, targeting specific laterals that their funding would connect, for example, staff and student homes, the laterals for those homes. And that's one way that they're ensuring that their funding is going to help students in these projects. So that's an example. And I'll put the link in the chat. I don't know if anyone else would like to add to that.
I think what we learned is that when necessary, there was a lot of creative problem solving, and we actually had a number of our districts ask us to bring them together and let them just talk to each other and brainstorm solutions and then leave the room, right? They just wanted the opportunity and someone to help get them in the right place so they could share what each one was doing and come up with these kind of unique ways of pooling their funds and solving their problems.
Great, thank you. And yeah, it would be great to have that webinar link. That way, if others want to, oh, perfect. Thank you, Rachel, so much. And it looks like Kurt also had, mentioning that the relief funding is a little bit more flexible than the E-rate funding. So you're right, Annette, it is, when we kind of get together and can learn from one another, that's the beauty, and the beauty in something like this, and in COSIN, what a wonderful organization to help us kind of learn and share together. And so thank you all. Thank you, Rachel, for sharing that link. Jim has another question wondering about the ECF fund options for more creative solutions too. So
Back to
Sure.
Rachel.
So I can try to take this one too. So Jim, we actually have had one application to expand service that was filed in the initial window, and I'm kind of following that to see what the progress is on that application. The difficulty with ECF is proving that there's not currently service. So working with the NTIA map, the broadband map, I could probably find a link to that and put it in the chat, and then working with your Public Service Commission and local data to show that there's actually not service where you're talking about using ECF funding.
And Alyssa, did you want to add anything to that one? I saw you kind of nodding and shaking your head.
No, that was a perfect answer. I was just going to scoop up the NTIA map link.
Thanks, Alyssa.
great, yes, and like Kurt said, it comes back to the data quality, right? And how important that having that data is. So, well, thank you all for a huge thank you to our wonderful panelists and this Wisconsin team. It is great to hear the collaboration and how much you all are supporting districts like Jen's and Hudson, and all of our COSIN members I know are learning from this. So thank you so much. If we have several other COSIN opportunities that we want to make you aware about. You probably know about these, but and I think Jill just dropped them all links in the chat. So thank you to Jill for that. There are several links there, but lots of great opportunities, especially a couple that I just want to highlight really quickly. That Early Career CTO Academy. So whether that's you or maybe just even somebody you know, to share that opportunity with. We know how important that cohort and academy has been for so many of our CTOs. And then of course the CEDL Foundations course that begins September 2nd. And so as well as our large district grapevine series and all the other great opportunities that you see coming up there. So thank you to all of our COSIN team for providing those, and especially thank you to our COSIN sponsors. We are so grateful, and we couldn't do this without you. And so you see our wonderful sponsors there, and then also our COSIN, our digital equity initiative sponsors there on the last slide.
Oh, before I go to the last slide, I just wanted to highlight here is the link for the feedback on the webinar experience, and make sure that gets put in the chat.
Yes. Thank you so much, Annette, for highlighting that. Yes, we would love your feedback on the webinar experience. And so Jill has put that link. If you'll just take a minute and fill that out really quickly. And also we put a link to our digital equity initiative there. I think I saw Keith put the link to the report, as well as I think Jill at the beginning. But we have several great things coming out of the Digital Equity Initiative and more to come. So we are looking forward to sharing those in the coming months. Let's give another big thank you to our panelists for today for sharing and taking the time. And thanks to each of you all for taking your time. We hope you have a wonderful day. And best of luck as we continue down this journey towards digital equity.